Facebook.
Recording in progress.
Okay, so we're all connected. This is SJ with Commission Shift. I am joined with Virginia Palacios, our Executive Director, and we are back because the Railroad Commission, it just had its monthly open meeting. And so we're here to explain and walk through and discuss some of the agenda items that happened in this month's open meeting. These are oil and gas items for the state of Texas. They affect all of us in some way. And as many people listening to this may already know, these open meetings are fast. They're usually about 30 minutes. Today's was 32 minutes long. And over 400 agenda items were decided on in this open meeting. So that was a lot to happen in 30 minutes. So we're going to sort of slow it down, talk about some of the highlights, and get into the implications of these decisions and what they mean for us. So Virginia, as always, thank you for joining. And I'll let you take it away with some of the things we were tracking this month.
Sure. So the case we were tracking was with Waste Facilities, Inc. And so this is a company that has permits to recycle on lease oil and gas waste. And so their permits are technically called on lease commercial recycling permits. And so they are allowed to take things like drill cuttings and other solid waste that comes from an oil and gas well pad and treat that on site and then use it as road base on an oil and gas lease for the lease roads themselves. They have been getting permits from the Railroad Commission for about a decade to do this. And during this most recent permit application, they were contesting Railroad Commission staff's determination that they're not allowed to take waste from other oil and gas leases and treat it on site. And the thing that's really weird about this is that Railroad Commission staff have documented over the past several years that they've been permitting this facility that it's always been clear that that facility was only ever allowed to accept waste that came from the exact lease that they were on. But the attorneys for this company are being really persistent in claiming that that is not the case. And I think it's an interesting study in rhetoric, right? And so I think we see this from the industry a lot. Sometimes we see it from the railroad commissioners themselves, where even though something is factually not true and they can't back it up as being true, they will just like hammer and hammer and hammer on a point on whatever their position is until someone makes it so. And so we really respect Railroad Commission staff for being really clear and documenting all the evidence that this company is simply incorrect, and they're not acknowledging their failure to follow the law here, or even request an appropriate permit for what it is they want to do. The silly part about all of this is that Railroad Commission specifically has permits that allow companies to do exactly what this company wants to do. And that company just needs to apply for a permit under that division of the Railroad Commission rules. But they're insisting that they get a permit under this other section of the Railroad Commission rules. So it's really kind of funny that this is happening. Another thing the company wants to do is be able to not only use this treated waste product as road base on lease roads, but sell it as aggregate that could be used for any number of other purposes. This is something that came up at the end of 2024 when the Railroad Commission was revising its big waste pit rules. And we saw that they were trying to give companies permits to be able to use these drill cuttings, which are potentially radioactive, as aggregate for construction fill and road base on county roads and all kinds of other places where it could be really dangerous to put this kind of waste. And so this company is trying to kind of like sneak in this other unintended use for the product into this permit application right now. We thought this was pretty cut and dry because of the amount of evidence that Railroad Commission staff presented in the case. But here we saw Chairman Wright vote to pass this item to the next conference. Commissioner Craddock came in right behind him and said, yes, I'd like to pass this one too. And so now we have two railroad commissioners who are going to be looking at this more carefully. I don't know if they'll end up overturning their staff's decision. We saw another case on this same agenda where they did something similar. And so last month, there was a company that had an item on the agenda. This was Bayou Bend CCS LLC. CCS stands for Carbon Capture and Storage. This is one of the first carbon capture and storage facilities proposed in Texas, and I think the very first offshore hub that's been proposed. But the company leaders failed to submit simple paperwork to ask for a plugging extension on their test well. They had a 90-day period that ended in October 2025 to come back into compliance, and they missed that deadline. And so we thought for sure the Railroad Commission was not going to allow them to renew their P5 report, which gives them authority to operate in Texas. And we thought that because the Railroad Commission pretty consistently in other oil and gas cases has been denying operators P5 reports when they miss those simple deadlines. And so at the last meeting in April, Wright voted to pass that item on to the next conference. And then today he said, oh, it looks like this company has come back into compliance. And so they didn't lose their P5 report. So these are some of the things that happen sometimes. And it's strange to see it happen. The commissioners often don't give a reason why they're going against the administrative law judge's decision or recommend these cases too.
Yeah, thanks for connecting those two agenda items because it involves the railroad commissioners exercising discretion that they have in their position to not immediately say yes to their staff recommendations. We don't know ultimately if they're gonna, like you said, we'll have to wait and see at the next open meeting if they, what they do, but it does seem like a sign that maybe they disagree with the staff recommendations. Is that right? Like, is there any other reason that they would pass on an agenda item?
I mean, that's the charitable view of it. I think the other perspective, and we don't know if this is true or not, is that they're influenced by campaign contributions. And like, we can't prove that. All we know is that sometimes the railroad commissioners get campaign contributions from these companies before and after key decision-making moments. And I haven't looked at the campaign finance reports, so I don't know for sure if this has happened in either of these two cases at the moment. But that opportunity is there because the campaign finance laws for the Railroad Commission just leave things wide open right now. Any company, any executive of a company can donate to railroad commissioner races any time of year, whether they're in an active campaign or not, and at any amount. And so that structure leaves the railroad commissioners open for potential bias.
Now, you mentioned some of the concerns with the waste pit facility, accepting waste that they didn't generate or using this waste that could be radioactive for different uses and applications. Can you speak to, and this kind of gets into the public input section, and some things we've said in the past about CCS, but why are we watching CCS wells in Texas, carbon capture and storage? What are the risks with that kind of well?
Yeah, so these are injection wells. They're designed to inject carbon dioxide underground at high pressure for long-term storage. The concept is that you would inject carbon dioxide into a saline aquifer where it would kind of mix in with the salt water and stay entrained for a long time, or mineralize with the surrounding rock over the course of hundreds of thousands of years. But one of the concerns that we have is that when carbon dioxide mixes with water, it forms carbonic acid. And so if there are well bores that intersect the area of review for where the plume is modeled to go underground, then those well bores might end up degrading. You could end up having some of that carbonic acid leak into aquifers. Another problem that you have that that causes potential groundwater contamination is that the CO2, because it's acidic, can cause other heavy metals that exist in the formation to start dropping out of solution. And then again, if those have a pathway to get into a freshwater aquifer, that could cause contamination. There's also a lot of doubt about whether the CO2 will remain in the formation that it's being injected into, because we don't know enough about how these cap rocks are structured. And so like geologists try to find a layer of rock that is impermeable, that they think will contain the fluid for a very long time. But the truth of the matter is, we just don't have enough knowledge about where these facilities are going to be located, and we don't know if there's like fissures in that cap rock, or if there's faults, or if there's going to be some way that the fluid or the gas could seep out of it. And so lots of concerns there.
Yeah, not a short list by any means. And so Commissioner Wright, or not Commissioner Wright, sorry, Commissioner Christian has in the past expressed doubts also about the safety of CCS and the utility of it. How do you interpret him saying that at open meetings, but also, when it comes to agenda items that have to do with CCS wells, giving operators a pass, so to speak, when they're out of compliance?
I mean, I would be surprised if the commissioner had actually even looked at the individual company names on all of the items. Like, it's possible that he didn't even know that he was voting on a CCS company's agenda item. Like, he might not have even been looking that closely. And I think that's been a concern with how these agendas are structured. They run through the agenda items so fast, and if it wasn't flagged for him, he maybe didn't even look at the case. I don't know.
So there were a couple other cases that we were watching as well. And you touched on this lightly, that there's been, at least lately, a trend of more operators getting consequences for their Rule 15 inactive well plugging rules, or their ability, like their P5 ability to operate, good faith claims about their ability to operate. Can you speak to those agenda items that have to do with operators and what the outcome was?
Sure. So there were a couple of other items that we were looking at in the hearings division, and the hearings division section of the agenda is where the railroad commissioners consider contested cases. And so not every case that comes past their desk has been protested or contested in every way, but at the top of the agenda, they're kind of looking more carefully at these cases that have gone through a process with the administrative law judges at the Railroad Commission. And so there was a company named Trivista, and the mineral owners were contesting Trivista's good faith claim to operate 3 leases that they have in Bastrop County. And so like these people had a lease that said, if the operator doesn't produce, or if the wells don't produce for 60 days or more, and the company hasn't reworked the wells within that time, then the lease is terminated, and the mineral owners can move on to another company and lease with a new company. And so this company, even though the wells had been inactive, I think for about a year actually, they hadn't left the lease. And then it turned out that they were suspected of swabbing the well. We've talked about this a little bit in the past, but swabbing is essentially a process where they lower like a cup or something down into the well bore, and they're kind of like slowly taking out oil from the well using this method. I'm not an engineer, so I'm probably not explaining that as well as I could. But swabbing is generally not allowed by the Railroad Commission, but they do have a process where you can apply for a permit to do swabbing. And these leases did not have a permit to swab. And so, the mineral owners are saying this company was illegally operating on our lease, and they were asking the Railroad Commission to find that the company did not have a good faith claim to operate and to order the wells to be plugged. And railroad commissioners did go along with that recommendation. So that's good for those mineral owners. In the other case, there was a company called Sahara Operating Company. They claimed that they didn't receive the Railroad Commission's letters notifying them that their P5 organization report was delinquent. Again, this delinquency happens when operators don't plug their wells or don't file for plugging extensions on time. Or if they haven't properly done surface cleanup on site. And so Railroad Commission will give the companies 90 days from the date that their P5 expires to go ahead and come into compliance. And the companies have to request a hearing from the Railroad Commission within 30 days so that they can show that they did come into compliance. And the company is claiming that they didn't get those 30 and 90-day letters and they just didn't know. But we've been seeing the Railroad Commission staff say that's not a good enough excuse. Like, you missed the deadline, you can't get your P5. And so that's why it's so surprising that the Railroad Commission went ahead and said that Bayou Bend CCS was fine and they came into compliance, because they clearly did not do any of these things, at least not from what we can see in the Railroad Commission case files. But with Sahara operating, several of their wells were inactive for 25 years or more, and they failed their mechanical integrity tests. And so this is a really big deal. If you fail a mechanical integrity test, that's pretty much it. Like, you have to have your well plugged. In some cases, I think the Railroad Commission will let operators fix the well, and then if they can prove they're passing a mechanical integrity test, then they can continue operating. But this company didn't do that, and so they lost their authority to operate in Texas.
Okay, yeah, that's a helpful rundown, because sometimes we see operators that just fail to do paperwork, and that's sort of the source of the problem. But in both of these cases, it sounds like there were very additional reasons to be concerned about them continuing to operate. I kind of want to go back to the swabbing. And why is illegally swabbing or swabbing without a permit, why is that bad? And also, how do mineral rights owners, I kind of want to understand their role a bit better and how they come to find out about this, or why they would care about swabbing.
So, is swabbing, from what I understand, it's like you're barely producing anything out of a well. It's going to be like a really, like, I mean, this well has like no pressure. You're just doing like the bare minimum that you can do to get by and say that your well is like still active. And the rules around a well being classified as active, I mean, the threshold is like you're producing like a barrel a month for 12 consecutive months. I mean, it's just a tiny amount of product that would be coming out of that well. And so a mineral owner would care about this. Because number one, you're going to want to have a well plugged if it's very old and you know it could create a risk later on. But as a mineral owner, you would rather be working with a capitalized company that can go and either rework the well and actually get paying quantities out of the well, or like plug that well and drill a new well on your minerals so that you can earn more money. So that's kind of the incentive for a mineral or royalty owner. Also, usually when mineral owners are leasing land or leasing their acreage, they will get an upfront bonus aside from the royalties. And usually that bonus that they get is like, it can be in some cases, depending on whether you have an oil or gas lease and how many acres you're talking about, it can be more attractive than the actual royalties that are like a long-term check coming from the well. And so mineral owners kind of like want the opportunity to go negotiate with oil and gas companies on that kind of thing.
Okay, so, and mineral right owners have the standing to actually take these operators to the Railroad Commission and say they need to do something and help us solve this problem, like what you were just saying. So,
Exactly. On these grounds of like having a good faith lease or a good faith claim. Yeah.
okay, so I'll move us to the next part of the agenda, which has to do with administrative updates. And there were a few things here. Virginia, do you want to pull out or highlight any updates, maybe about flaring? There was something about a new form that could prevent or help strengthen rules to prevent wildfires. How does that
Sure.
relate to the Railroad Commission?
Yeah, so the EPA has been in the Trump administration trying to roll back a methane rule that was passed in the Biden administration, but they haven't done that quite fast enough. And so um, and certainly like we want the methane rule to stay in place because it will ostensibly eliminate routine flaring from new oil wells. And so the deadline for new oil wells that were drilled in 2024 to come into compliance with that requirement was May 7th, 2026. And so we saw new guidance come out from the EPA that was kind of telling operators, well, actually, the rule says that you can still flare temporarily in upset conditions for a period of 30 days. And so they're kind of giving operators an out. And I want to say there's even maybe an exception to that restriction. The attorney from the Railroad Commission that was explaining this guidance to the railroad commissioners also kind of made it sound like this isn't even going to affect the state rules and how the state venting and flaring rules are implemented. I took a quick look at statewide Rule 32, which is the venting and flaring rule in Texas. And I think part of the reason why she's saying that is because the Railroad Commission generally allows flaring within the first 10 days of a well's operation. And then anything more than that, then the operators have to apply for a flaring permit. But those flaring permits can be granted for a period of up to 180 days, and then they can come back and ask for an extension on it. And some operators can even ask for a permanent exception to the flaring rule prohibition. And so it's a little odd for them to say like, oh, you don't have to end routine flaring as long as we're granting rule exceptions. And so I don't know the whole in and out of the EPA rule, so I'm not sure if Railroad Commission staff are interpreting it correctly or not. I do know that the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality was supposed to go through what's called a state implementation plan rulemaking in Texas to be able to fully implement the methane rule. And they haven't done that yet. They keep delaying because they're waiting for EPA to roll back the methane rule. And so it might be that the attorney is saying we don't have to worry about anything because the TCEQ hasn't even put through the implementation plan yet.
Okay, yes, there's a lot of factors with that one it sounds like is an evolving situation.
Yeah. Well, and I guess like another thing that's important for the audience to know that's also, relevant in light of how the Railroad Commission works is that, there is evidence that before President Trump's reelection, he asked the country's top oil and gas executives for $1 billion in exchange for rollbacks of environmental and health safeguards, including those that prevent methane pollution. And so, those kinds of conflicts of interest are really concerning. Like there has been a fight for a long time, and people impacted by venting and flaring have been asking the EPA for over a decade to implement rules like this. You finally get them in the Biden administration, and then they get rolled back in the Trump administration. And so this kind of like keeps going back and forth, and it's very clear that it's happening because of the industry money that is involved in politics in the United States.
Thanks for walking us through that one. There were some other things in the administrative agenda. Do you want to touch on those, or should we talk about public input?
Yeah, I'll just make a quick note about the wildfire prevention. And so there was a bill passed in 2025 that essentially requires operators to certify that they have removed electricity from an oil and gas well site prior to, well, after they essentially like close the site. And so it can be before the well is plugged, but they have to certify that if it's an inactive well, they've removed that electricity connection. And the reason is because uh, those electricity connections at both inactive and orphaned wells in the Panhandle uh, were believed to have caused a lot of those wildfires that we saw in 2024. And so it was 1,500 square miles of rangeland that were burned in 2024 because of those wildfires. And so this bill, I think, also increased the penalties to operators that lie on their forms. And this particular rulemaking that was approved today simply updated the form that operators have to file with the Railroad Commission to certify that they disconnected electricity.
And we haven't really talked about wildfires all that much when we talk about inactive and abandoned old wells. But that is another ramification of these. We talk about geysers, we talk about subsurface conditions and contamination, but also electrical equipment that isn't properly decommissioned, right? Is this rule, obviously, it seems like a step in the right direction. Do you have any additional thoughts about what could help, solve or prevent this problem at a policy level?
Yeah, I think we need more inspectors at the Railroad Commission, and that's just a simple fact. I mean, we can't continue with a ratio of more than 1,000 wells per inspector and expect that these sites are not going to prevent a safety hazard or a risk to groundwater. We just need more inspectors at the Railroad Commission. The oil and gas industry needs to pay for it. And so we need the legislature to authorize the Railroad Commission to increase fees and surcharges and taxes that operators pay so that we can have proper oversight of this industry.
All right. And for public input today, we had a few new faces and names. It's always a pretty small group that comes to the Railroad Commission to Austin to deliver comments. This is still, you have to be in person to deliver comments at the open meeting, and that is worth saying and repeating that there isn't a virtual option to engage with the Railroad Commissioners in this setting. You can stream it, but you can't give comments. So some people made the trip, and I think we should highlight their messages. We can go in order if you want, Virginia, since Skylar was the first to speak. What did he bring to the Railroad Commission today?
Yeah, so Skylar was generally talking about the importance of the Railroad Commission having penalties that hurt the operators. And so, he had this analogy of how, if he's speeding down the highway and a cop turns on their lights, he's going to pull over because he knows that that cop is, number one, trying to enforce the law. Number two, that he's going to be in pretty bad trouble if he doesn't pay attention and follow the law. And it's going to get worse if he's a repeat offender, right? And so, he has that mentality because the highway patrol is consistent in how they enforce the rules. And so he explained that the Railroad Commission does not consistently enforce its rules and the penalties are not high enough. And so if the operators don't have a little sting whenever they get a penalty, then they're just going to keep making the same mistakes over and over again, and they're going to be repeat violators, which is what he's seeing on his ranch today.
Yeah, I thought that was a good analogy.
Yeah, it was a good analogy. And then I was able to give public input, and I just wanted to draw attention to the leak that happened in Grand Falls a few weeks ago. This was a leak that just started coming out of the ground near a Baptist church. They later attributed it to a well that was drilled in the 1930s and had already been plugged. That said, the plugging standards in the 1930s were not what they are today. And so, Grand Falls is located in Ward County. This is one of the counties where we've seen a number of geyser-like well blowouts, earthquakes, leaks from plugged and unplugged wells already. And so, to us, it's just more proof that the Railroad Commission really needs to update its rules on class 2 injection. And so we think we're seeing all of these leaks, not only because there are poorly plugged wells out there or unplugged wells out there, but because of the tremendous volumes of underground injection of produced water in Texas. The state needs to get a handle on this. I don't think the answer is simply to treat the produced water and spray it on crops or discharge it into rivers and streams. But we do need the Railroad Commission to have strong rules in place so that it is not permitting class 2 injection wells in an area that's already overpressurized. One comment that I made is that, we saw a presentation that the Railroad Commission Oil and Gas Division gave to operators talking about their new emergency response plan and their proposal for an operator-led emergency response plan. And so some of the things the Railroad Commission is talking about doing in that emergency response plan is good. It's stuff that we would suggest. And so they're talking about moratoriums on injection. They're talking about rescinding or amending permits. And they're talking about no longer assuming that they have an infinitely acting reservoir. So not assuming that they can inject as much as they want forever and ever, which is physically impossible. And so we're glad to see these kinds of changes taking place and how the Railroad Commission staff think about these problems. I wanted to reiterate for the commissioners today that the reason why they have permitting authority is so that they can say no sometimes. If the idea was that industry will be fine if they have no restrictions and they can do whatever they want all the time, then we wouldn't have a permitting process. But the permitting process is there so that someone can set a boundary and say this is okay and that's not. And so we want the Railroad Commission to use that authority that they have and to make better decisions here, both when it comes to response, but also being preventative. And to us, being preventative means having a better class 2 permitting rules so that you don't have the opportunity for this overpressurization to occur.
It is good. Awareness is the first step, as they say. So they're acknowledging there is a problem, and hopefully that leads us to building a solution that that everyone has input on and that is a bit more equitable and safe for communities that are near these wells that could spring back to life because of overinjection, right?
And then let's see, we heard from Lindsay Golden, who is with the Scientists Roundtable on Carbon Capture and Storage. And she gave the Railroad Commissioners the rundown on carbon capture and storage and its risks and why we're concerned. She talked about the toxicity of carbon dioxide, that, if you're exposed to carbon dioxide in high concentrations, it can be fatal and cause suffocation. And she talked about studies that show that there's a 2-mile kill zone radius from pipeline ruptures. And so we're glad that she came to kind of share that perspective today. After her, we heard from another scientist, Alexis Uwasu, who also has a decade of experience working in oil and gas. And she brought in data about how carbon capture and storage plants across the world have all failed. And so she talked about a few case studies of not only the costs of these plants skyrocketing, but the fact that these plants never captured the amount of carbon dioxide that they were predicted they would be able to capture.
And we'll update all of these video clips of people giving their input and these agenda decision items in Commission Shift's blog post. So we'll link that as well. So if you want to listen to these public comments or read more about these agenda items, they'll be in that blog recapping the open meeting. But I think that takes us through just about all our highlights this time around. The next Railroad Commission open meeting is Tuesday, June 2nd. So it is coming up fast, and we'll be here with more highlights and updates from that open meeting as well. We are expecting the monitoring enforcement plan. Next year's plan will be finalized. And will it be shared by that date, or are we going to see it at a later time? Do we know?
I think they just have to publish it by July 1st. And so they did tell us that they plan to translate the final plan before they publish it. So it might be a little bit after the June 2nd meeting by the time they get it posted on the website.
Okay, we'll be watching out for that one. So many people gave written comments on that plan and suggestions for its improvement. So thank you to everyone who got involved in that process, and we'll be watching to see what they adopt into their plan for next year. And in the meantime, as always, please follow us on social media. Our website is commissionshift.org. You can sign up for our free monthly newsletter where we share more oil and gas updates. And we will see you next time on June 2nd. And thanks, Virginia, for joining today.
Thanks, SJ. Take care.